They say the earth still bleeds where her feet once stood. Even now, under the hush of cicadas and the sigh of the moss-hung trees, the ground seeps a slow, ruddy breath, the kind that smells of iron and memory. The old plantation lies rotted on the edge of the swamp, its bones half swallowed by creeping vines and fever-thick air. The great house leans upon itself like an exhausted body, shutters hanging like torn eyelids. No one farms this land anymore. No one dares to. The soil rejects seed, spits up roots, and stains the hands of any who touch it with a rust-colored mark that never fades. Locals whisper her name only as the wind stirs, a name not written in any book, but carved into the dirt by trembling fingers. They say she was a woman taller than all the men who broke her back in chains. They say her eyes were the color of storm water, her voice low enough to shake the teeth in a man's skull. No preacher dare speak her story in daylight. Yet when the moon slants red and swollen, the tale stirs like something buried alive. Once, they murmur, she walked the fields at dawn, and the earth bowed to her weight. Beneath the ruins of the old veranda lies the mark of her heel, 7 inches deep into the red clay, hardened like stone. No matter the rain, the wind, or the seasons, it remains. Sometimes when thunder approaches, it fills with dark water that ripples, as though something beneath it still breathes. Those who've looked too long claim they've seen the reflection of a face that is not their own. Subscribe to Chains and Shadows, for her story is still being told in the breath between heartbeats. Those who listen too long will hear her chains drag across their dreams. The overseer's house was the first to collapse. Its beams went soft with rot, and the roof folded inward like a dying lung. Yet the fireplace still burns sometimes, though no hand has lit it in 100 years. Travelers say the flames don't glow yellow. They burn the color of dried blood. And if you walk close enough, you can hear it, the low chime of metal shifting in the coals. Her chains. They say she was brought here from an island far to the east, where storms spoke with tongues of fire. 6 men were needed to hold her down. She was taller than any of them, shoulders broad as an ox, eyes hollow with defiance. When they bound her, the earth trembled, not from her weight but from her rage. The field hands refused to touch her. They crossed themselves, spat salt into the dust, and said she was born of something older than the world's mercy. The mistress of the house ordered her to be broken, tamed, humbled before God and man. But the god of that plantation had no dominion over her bones. At night she sang in a tongue no one knew. The melody crawled through the cane like mist, wound itself around sleeping ears, and filled the dreams of the cruel with drowning red. The 6 men who shackled her began to wake with bruises on their throats, the perfect shape of fingers, too large to belong to any living soul. One took a pistol into the field one dawn and fired it at the dirt, screaming that something beneath the ground was whispering his name. The next morning he was gone. Only his boots remained, half sunk in mud that pulsed like it was breathing. The others fled before sunrise, but their footprints never led away. They circled the same patch of field again and again, deeper each time, until they vanished into the wet, red earth. The plantation's mistress prayed for deliverance, but her prayers came back to her as laughter, low drawn and wet with sorrow. "You built your house upon my bones," a voice whispered through her shutters. "Now your name shall feed my roots." No one saw the woman again after that night. Only the chains were found, coiled neat beside the well, slick with dew that smelled faintly of blood and violets. The well water turned red for 7 nights, then black forever after. In the middle field, where the clay grows hardest, there still stands a tree older than the house itself. Its bark is dark, cracked, and rough with scarring that looks too deliberate to be natural. The shapes of wrists, shoulders, and a woman's back pressed deep into its grain. The wind moves differently there. It doesn't whisper, it listens. And if you stand there long enough, if you press your ear to the trunk, you can hear a rhythm. Not a heartbeat, not a song. The sound of chains dragging across stone. Subscribe to Chains and Shadows and remember her name when the ground beneath you hums. For she is not gone, only waiting for the next footstep to fall upon her red clay. When the last light of dusk fades, the earth exhales once more, slow, patient, deliberate. The air grows heavy with a scent like rain before it breaks, and something moves in the soil, swelling against the weight of its burial. The mark of her heel deepens, and in the silence between the cicadas' song, a voice rises from the dirt, soft as breath, rough as rusted iron. I never left. The ground trembles. The chains beneath the earth shudder like serpents awakening, and the old house groans as if trying to stand again. She was born too tall for mercy, too strong for man's law. The midwife swore her cries cracked the rafters and summoned crows to the window. They came in a black fever, wings beating like a drum of bad omens, their eyes glittering with the reflection of something ancient and unquiet. No child, the midwife whispered. No mortal child at all. The birthing took place in a cabin squatting low beside the cane field, walls breathing in and out with the storm that clawed the roof that night. The air smelled of copper and sweat, of lightning and fear. Each contraction seemed to shake the foundation itself, as though the earth refused to cradle what it was being asked to bear. When at last the infant slid free, slick and steaming with life, the midwife staggered back. The newborn's limbs were long, the fingers stretching like roots seeking soil, and her first breath came out not as a cry, but as a sound deep and strange, closer to a growl than a wail. The candle blew out, and in the dark, the midwife felt the heat of that sound ripple through her bones. "Cover it!" she hissed to the woman laboring on the cot. "Cover the thing before it learns your name." But the mother, weary, pale, trembling, only smiled through tears. "She's beautiful," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Look at her eyes. They shine like storm glass." Outside, thunder rolled low. The crows screamed, startled into flight, scattering into the endless dark. By morning, word spread through the quarters like smoke. A giant child had been born. The master's men came to see her, boot heels crushing the dawn grass, breath fogging in the cold. They looked upon the baby and felt something twist in their chests. Not pity, not awe, but something nearer to fear. At 6 months, she sat upright. At 1 year, she walked. By 2, she stood at her mother's shoulder, silent and grave-eyed, her small hands already strong enough to bend a spoon. The other children whispered she had no shadow of her own, that it belonged to something else, something that walked a few steps behind her and smiled when she didn't. At night, the midwife could not sleep. She dreamt of the birth again and again, the rafters creaking, the storm pressing its face against the windows, that terrible voice that wasn't a cry. She began to hear it when she was awake, faintly, in the sound of the wind through the cane, or the soft knock of a branch on her shutters. "Too tall for mercy," the whisper said. "Too strong for chains." When the girl was 5, she stopped speaking. Her mother said she understood things without words, that she could sense moods and thoughts like scent on the air. Animals avoided her. Dogs barked until their throats went raw. Horses refused to come near her shadow. Then came the night of the frost, rare in that southern place, when the ground glazed over with ice, and the fields turned ghostly white. The midwife was found in her bed, eyes open, face blue, mouth frozen into a rictus of awe or terror. Her hut smelled of rain and iron. On the wall above her, drawn in frost, were the faint imprints of a hand far larger than any man's. The people of the plantation began to call the child the Tower's daughter. Some said she was born of thunder, others that the devil had fathered her through the storm. The overseer laughed, called them fools, and ordered her to carry water buckets twice her size. She obeyed silently, but when he tried to strike her for spilling one, the handle broke in his grasp, splintered clean through as though some invisible force had caught his arm mid-swing. He never raised a hand to her again. As she grew, so too did the fear. No matter how far the sun climbed, the shadows around her seemed too deep, clinging to her feet like roots. Her eyes reflected not the light, but something behind it, a deeper gleam, cold and old. The preacher called her cursed. The mistress called her unnatural. Her mother only said, "She was never meant to kneel." One summer night a fever took hold of the child. She burned for 3 days, muttering words in a tongue no one knew. The house trembled with each whisper, and those who came near felt the air thicken, as though the walls themselves bent toward her, listening. When she woke, the fever gone, the house's windows had shattered inward. She looked to her mother and said her first words in years, "The chains are coming." Her mother tried to hush her, but the child only stared at the floor. "They are making them now," she murmured, her voice soft, detached, as though repeating what she heard from someone standing just behind her. "The men by the forge, they think they will bind me." And from far across the fields, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed, slow, deliberate, endless. That night, the mother took her daughter and fled into the swamps. But the swamp does not hide what it wishes to reveal. The master's men found the girl by morning, standing alone on a ridge of red clay. There was no sign of the mother, only footprints that led into the water and stopped. The men stared at her, a child no longer, her shoulders broad, her back straight, eyes burning with a stillness that made them forget their orders. "Come with us," one said. She tilted her head. "If I go," she answered, "you will dig 6 graves." They laughed uneasily, bound her hands, and led her back. The plantation awoke to screams that did not belong to her. When the sun rose, 6 men were missing. The girl was back in the quarters, silent, her wrists marked only by soot, and though the morning was clear, the sky rumbled as if something vast was stirring above the clouds, a sound like the low, patient rolling of chains. By dusk she was gone again. Her footprints led not into the swamp this time, but to the high ridge where the soil was dark and clotted. The same crows that had come on the night of her birth perched along the trees, silent now, their eyes fixed on something none dared to see. Beneath the last light of the sun, the red clay shimmered, wet as blood, and from that trembling ground rose the faint outline of another shadow, taller than the girl herself, arms long and reaching, as if it had finally found her. The shadow leaned close, and the wind swallowed her name. The chapel was never meant to hold screams. Its rafters were carved for hymns, for hallelujahs, for the trembling pleas of the obedient, not the sound that split the air that day. Morning light had no mercy when it spilled through the warped glass, bending over dust and splinters, falling upon the woman who stood bound before the altar. She was too tall for the chapel's frame. Her head nearly brushed the beams. The chains at her wrists hung slack, not from weakness but from her stillness. Her eyes were closed. Her breath came slow, measured, deliberate, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. Outside, the congregation waited. Men, women, children, pressed close together, clutching crosses, their throats tight with prayer and fear. No one dared to enter. The preacher had ordered the doors barred. He said the devil himself wore her skin, that the Lord demanded her humbling. So they built the collar, a ring of black iron, heavy and rough, forged in the overseer's shed. Its edges were cruelly turned inward, meant to bite when tightened. 6 men carried it into the chapel, their hands shaking, the metal leaving dark stains on their palms. "She was born to blasphemy," the preacher said, voice echoing through the rafters. "A creature of the storm. Today we put the Lord's ring upon her neck." The woman did not open her eyes. She only tilted her head slightly, the chains whispering like rain. "You mistake thunder for sin," she murmured, voice low and even. "And you mistake your God for mine." The preacher flinched. A drop of sweat slid down his temple, caught in the light like a bead of mercury. He raised the Bible and struck it open with a trembling hand. "Behold the beast," he shouted, "and see how pride falls." The 6 men moved forward, each step echoing like nails being driven into a coffin. One held the collar, another the bolt, another the hammer. The sound of metal against metal rang like a bell for the condemned. When they reached her, she opened her eyes, and the air changed. It thickened, grew heavy, as though the chapel had sunk under water. The flame of the single candle warped sideways, straining against some unseen current. One of the men dropped his end of the chain and began to weep quietly. "Do it," the preacher barked. Before she speaks again, they lifted the collar. The iron was cold when it touched her skin. Her body did not flinch, but every board beneath her feet groaned as if something vast was pressing upward from the earth. Then, the bolt struck. The sound that followed was not of hammer on metal, but of thunder answering thunder. The chapel shook. The cross above the altar cracked clean through. The preacher staggered back, clutching his Bible to his chest. She raised her head. The iron collar gleamed black in the half-light, but the metal hissed, faintly, like something alive. "You hear it?" she asked. "It knows your name." The preacher tried to speak, but his throat refused him. His voice rose instead as a wet gurgle, and he dropped the Bible, clutching at his mouth. Smoke curled from between his lips, the faint oily smoke of burning flesh. The 6 men fell to their knees, staring in horror as blisters bloomed across the preacher's tongue. His words melted into breathless, bubbling cries. The air reeked of iron and salt, and she only watched. Outside, the storm that had been waiting beyond the hills broke open, sudden, wild, and laughing. Thunder rolled across the fields, shattering the silence of the onlookers. Rain struck the windows with a furious rhythm, like fists demanding entry. Inside, the preacher fell. His head struck the step of the altar with a crack. The candle died, smoke winding like a serpent through the dark. The woman spoke again, her voice softer now. "You put iron on what you fear. But iron remembers its maker." She touched the collar with her fingertips. The metal shuddered under her touch. Not rattled, shuddered, and the clasp fell open without sound. The collar dropped to the floor. It landed not with a clang, but with a sigh, and the boards beneath it blackened. As if something had been drawn out of them, the 6 men ran. The door that had been barred from within opened of its own accord, slamming wide as if kicked by wind. The congregation scattered into the rain, shouting of curses and hellfire. Only she remained. Only she, standing beneath the split cross, rain dripping through the roof to run down her shoulders, like baptism gone wrong. She stepped forward. Each footfall sounded like a heartbeat made of stone. At the altar's base she stopped, looked down at the dead man who had called her beast, and whispered, "The sermon is ended." The thunder answered again, closer this time. In the fields beyond the chapel, the cane bent under the weight of wind. The rain carved dark rivers through the soil, red as if the earth itself bled. The collar rolled across the floorboards, circling itself once, twice, then coming to rest at the threshold. When lightning flashed, its reflection showed not one band of iron, but 7, faintly interlinked. As though the collar's shadow had multiplied, she stepped through the doorway into the storm. The people who had fled knelt in the mud, faces pressed to the ground. None dared to look up. And those who did said her chains were gone, but she walked as if something invisible still dragged behind her, heavy and patient, clinking softly with every step. By dawn, the chapel was gone. The storm had torn its roof away, leaving only the altar and the blackened mark where the collar had lain. The Bible was found in the mud, its pages fused together by heat. The preacher's tongue, burnt to a hard grey curl, was nailed to the door by some unseen hand. The air around the ruins hummed, low, constant, unsettling, like a sermon whispered backward. And in the distance, where the fields met the swamp, a woman's voice carried on the wind, deep and resonant, calling out names that had not yet been buried. And somewhere beyond the storm's edge, 6 men awoke to find their throats bound by invisible metal, the faint, eternal echo of her laughter still ringing in the rain. Night fell like a curtain soaked in tar. The sky was a lid of black glass, the stars buried behind it, unseen, uncaring. In the far fields, the cane swayed with a sound too rhythmic to be wind, too steady to be innocent. From the great house lanterns burned low, their glow sickly and orange like open sores in the dark. 6 men gathered at the edge of the barn, boots slick with mud and hearts thumping against the quiet. They were chosen for their strength, though each prayed in secret that his strength would not be tested. The overseer had given the order at sundown. "The giant woman broke her chains again," he said, voice thin as rusted wire. "You'll bring her back before the master wakes." But none had seen her since the storm at the chapel, since the preacher's tongue blistered and the iron collar hissed like something alive. The 6 men whispered among themselves that she had walked into the woods without leaving footprints, that she spoke to the thunder now, that the rain followed her voice. Still, they went. Because fear on the plantation was a river that flowed both ways, fear of her and fear of those who commanded her torment. The barn waited in silence, sagging under the weight of its own history. The moonlight did not reach it. Its doors yawned open just enough to show a sliver of darkness so pure it seemed solid. The first man spat into the dirt and crossed himself. "We go in together," he said. "There ain't nothing inside but a woman." The second man laughed under his breath, a sound brittle as glass. "A woman don't split a cross clean through, Amos." The others said nothing. They looked at the doors, the shadows trembling along the frame, and waited for courage to return. It didn't. When they stepped inside, the air changed. It smelled of iron and rot, of old blood turned sweet. The walls sweated moisture. Hay lay scattered like a bed for something larger than man or beast. From the rafters hung ropes that had frayed themselves loose, as if whatever they once held had pulled until they surrendered. The third man lifted his lantern. The flame bent sideways as though straining away from the dark. "You hear that?" Someone whispered, a pause. Then the faintest sound. Metal upon metal, slow breathing. The lantern flickered. The sound came again. A soft rattle, then stillness, like chains being turned in sleep. "She's in the loft," said Amos. "Keep quiet." They climbed the ladder one by one. The hay shifted beneath their boots, sighing as if the barn itself exhaled. When the first man reached the top, he froze. Lord above. The rest joined him and silence fell. The chains were there, coiled neatly, glistening in the light, but they were empty. No wrists, no body, just the iron moving ever so slightly, as though something unseen breathed through it. Then a whisper. "Who holds who?" It came from everywhere at once. From the rafters, the hay, the walls themselves. The men turned, weapons half drawn, hearts climbing their throats. The barn door slammed shut. The lantern went out. Darkness took shape. They heard her before they saw her. The slow scrape of bare feet across wood. The creak of the beams groaning under her weight. The smell of rain, sudden and heavy, filled the air, though no drop fell. When the lightning struck outside, for an instant she stood before them, tall, spectral, her skin streaked with red clay, eyes gleaming like lanterns drowned under water. Around her neck hung nothing, but the air itself seemed chained to her. The light vanished. "You came to bind me again," her voice murmured in the dark, slow as the toll of a bell. "But I was never yours to bind." The sound of chains followed, slithering, coiling, not from her hands but from the corners of the barn. Iron rose like snakes awakened, wrapping around beams, walls, and men alike. The more they struggled, the tighter it drew, links grinding against bone and wood. One tried to run for the door, but the chain snapped taut around his ankle, dragging him backward into the dark. He screamed once, and a short, clean sound, then nothing. Only the echo of rattling metal, steady like breath. Another shouted a prayer. The words curdled in his mouth. His voice broke midway through, replaced by the wet gurgle of something filling his throat. The lantern flared back to life for a heartbeat, showing him, suspended from the rafters, eyes open, neck ringed with links that moved without hands. The others broke, pounding at the door. It wouldn't move. The boards wept sap. The hinges groaned. From outside came the low growl of thunder, so close it seemed to crawl beneath the floor. She moved among them, slow, silent, terrible. The air trembled where she passed. One man swore later that she didn't walk but drifted, the chains carrying her like a bride borne by her own instruments of death. "You called me beast," she said softly. "Now you feed the iron that named me." The last man, Amosias, fell to his knees. His tears cut clean lines down the dust on his cheeks. "Mercy," he whispered. "Please, mercy." The woman looked down at him. Her expression was neither rage nor pity, only the exhaustion of centuries. "Mercy was buried with the preacher," she said. "You left it in the earth." She turned, and the chains obeyed. When the barn door finally gave way under the storm's hand, it swung open with a cry. Rain poured in, washing over the floor slick with blood, but no bodies remained. Only the chains piled like sleeping serpents, steaming faintly in the cold, and beneath them the sound, soft, rhythmic, as if they still breathed. At dawn, the plantation awoke to silence. The overseer found the barn empty. The soil outside turned to red mud, 6 sets of boot prints leading in but none returning. The air above the barn shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from cold ground. When he leaned close, he heard something within that shimmer. A faint whisper. 6 for the chain. 1 for the sun. He stumbled back, crossing himself, eyes wide. The sound grew louder, sharper, until he realized it wasn't whispering at all, it was laughter. The same thunderous laughter that rolled through the chapel when the iron collar closed. A laughter that shook the sky and sent the birds screaming into flight. The overseer fled, but the sound followed him down the path, echoing in every clink of his spurs, every creak of the gate. And when he reached the house, breath ragged, heart hammering, he saw on the front steps a single length of chain, coiled like a question mark, still wet, still warm, and still breathing. The rain began before dawn, thin, steady, endless, but not a drop would touch the barn floor. It hissed on the roof and slid away, as though repelled by something deeper than wood or soil. Beneath the rafters the air hung thick, swollen with the perfume of rust and rot. The ground was slick with blood, yet not a single bead of it had sunk into the clay. It glimmered there instead, dark and perfect, like pearls strung along the seams of the earth. The plantation awoke in silence that morning. The overseer's house stood empty, its door ajar, the lantern still burning low. Chickens wandered through the yard unbothered, yet the dogs refused to bark. The workers, gathering at the edge of the field, whispered without moving closer. They said the woman had returned, that her chains had fed, and now the soil itself had turned against God. Those who crept near the barn swore they could see their own reflections in the blood, warped and swaying, as though the liquid held a second sky beneath its surface. One boy, too bold or too foolish to heed the warnings, reached down with a stick and touched it. The blood clung to the wood thick as tar, and when he tried to shake it off, it did not fall. "Leave it," an old woman hissed. "It remembers." The boy dropped the stick and ran. The stain stayed behind, smoking faintly where it touched the ground. By mid-morning the sky broke open. Lightning clawed across the heavens, tearing them into white ribbons. Thunder followed, rolling long and slow like the turning of some vast wheel, but the rain still refused the earth. It struck the air, the rooftops, the trees, but where it should have met the red clay it curved away, vanishing into mist. That was when the blood began to move. Not fast, not at first. Just a shiver, a ripple, a trembling across the barn's threshold, like something breathing beneath a still surface. The first man to see it was a field hand named Jonah. He fell to his knees and began to pray aloud. But each word came back to him echoing, reversed, as if the ground were whispering through his mouth instead. He tore himself away, stumbled backward, and watched as the beads of blood gathered together, joining, swelling. The liquid crept toward the doorway, slow as thought, coiling upon itself. "She's not done," Jonah whispered. "Lord, she's not done." By noon word had reached the big house. The mistress, pale and trembling, sent 2 men to bury the remains, though none could say what remains were left to find. They carried shovels, rosaries, and the smell of fear. The barn waited for them. Inside, the air was colder. The walls, once brown with age, now shimmered faintly red in the dim light. Flies buzzed thick in the corners, their wings humming a single low note. The men stepped carefully, boots squelching in the blood that refused to sink. "We dig," one muttered, quick and quiet. But when they struck the ground, the clay screamed. The sound was not human, not animal, but something deep and metallic like iron tearing through its own bones. Their shovels shook in their hands. One fell to his knees, pressing his palms against his ears, his eyes wide and wet. The other froze. His shovel blade gleamed red, though he had not touched blood. "It's under us," he breathed. A vibration ran through the floorboards, soft at first, then stronger, rhythmic. It came with a sound like chains dragged across stone, each link singing low and hollow. The men looked at each other. "She ain't dead," one said. "She was never dead," said the other. The lantern flared, its flame twisting sideways. A voice rolled out of the dark, low, measured, and full of quiet fury. "The blood remembers what the earth forgets." The men bolted. They did not make it 10 paces before the ground gave a long, wet sigh. Blood surged upward, a wave of black-red liquid that burst against the walls, splattering across their faces. The stench was unbearable, sweet, cloying, alive. One man fell, his foot caught in a coil of something that slithered beneath the surface. When he reached down to pull free, his hand came back slick with something thicker than mud, something that pulsed once before letting go. They ran until their voices broke. By dusk, the rain had stopped. The plantation shimmered in a red haze, steam rising from the earth like breath. The barn stood silent once more. But the ground around it, that was no longer the same. Everywhere the blood had touched, the clay had turned dark and glassy. It no longer yielded to the shovel nor to the hoe. Seeds laid upon it blackened overnight. The earth had become mirror and grave both, reflecting the sky in its fevered shine. The workers refused to step near it. At night they heard sounds, the groan of links being pulled, the slow drag of something vast and deliberate moving below. The old woman who had warned the boy said she dreamed of the chains lying open, spread across the fields like rivers of iron. "She is weaving," the woman said. "What's she weaving?" someone asked. "A way back." The mistress locked herself inside her room and prayed until her voice failed. On the 7th night, she found her floorboards slick beneath her feet, blood seeping from between the cracks, winding toward her bedpost. She screamed, but no one came. The next morning her windows were open, her sheets soaked crimson, and the air smelled faintly of salt and rain. No trace of her body remained, only the faint print of a woman's foot pressed into the rug beside the bed, 7 inches deep, as if made by someone impossibly tall. The overseer returned on the 8th day. His eyes were hollow, his clothes damp, his boots leaving no prints. He said nothing to the others. He walked to the barn, slow and steady, and stood in the doorway for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was not his own. "The blood would not sink," he murmured, "because it is not finished." The others watched from afar as he knelt in the red mud and pressed his hands into it. The blood accepted him, swallowed him inch by inch, until only his hat floated atop the surface. Then even that was gone. By twilight the barn began to hum. The sound was low and constant, the same pitch as thunder before it breaks. Birds rose screaming from the trees, and the cattle broke from their pens. The sky turned the color of old rust. Those who dared to look back saw the blood begin to spread again. Slow, deliberate, curling out from the barn like veins seeking a heart, and in its reflection, if you stood close enough, you could see her face. Pale, enormous, sorrowful, looking up from beneath the surface, waiting. When night fell, the wind shifted. From the far fields came the sound of chains, not clashing, not dragging, but singing as though struck like bells. The plantation slept uneasily. The rain came again, and this time it did not stop. They said the ground had grown restless, that the 6 unmarked stones, once set to seal her, now shifted at night as if the earth beneath them were breathing again. No one went near those graves after sunset. The soil there was not like the rest. It was redder, looser, always damp, as though the rain remembered its path too well. The stones, half sunk in clay, leaned in strange directions, their shadows long even beneath a half-moon. The plantation workers called the place the Sixfold Field. The overseer called it handled business. But the old ones, those who remembered her cries, called it what it truly was, unfinished. It began on a Wednesday when the wind refused to die. The air hung heavy with iron and whisper. Dogs barked until their throats bled, then fell silent all at once. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the sound of dragging, slow, deliberate, traced its way through the brush. Those awake swore it came from 6 different places at once. The first to see it was a girl named Marnie, a field hand's daughter. She rose from her cot before dawn, drawn by the soft clinking of metal, faint but steady like the breathing of a forge. When she stepped outside, the fog was thick enough to drown in. The lantern light barely touched the air. She said she saw footprints, deep, wet, and moving backward, leading from the farthest grave toward the barn. "Mama," she whispered, "someone's walking where no one should." "No one," her mother answered, clutching her rosary tight. "Go inside. The dead are counting their bones tonight." By morning, all 6 stones had moved. Not far, not much, just tilted as though nudged from below. But one had cracked clean down the middle, the split smooth and blackened at its edges. Beneath it, a hollow hiss rose from the earth, faint but steady, like a chain dragged through deep water. The preacher came by noon, summoned in trembling haste. His voice quavered as he opened his book, reading from the pages though his eyes refused to meet them. "Ashes to ashes," he began, but the wind took the words before they landed. "Speak louder," someone urged. "If I do," he whispered, "she'll hear me." He pressed the cross into the soil and left it there. By dusk, the metal had tarnished black. That night, the first shape appeared at the edge of the fields. It was tall, too tall, swaying like a tree bent by unseen hands. Its head hung low, its arms hung longer still. Chains clinked faintly at its wrists. But when it moved, the sound came not from its steps, but from the ground behind it, as though something followed beneath the dirt. Pacing its every motion, the workers locked themselves inside their shacks. They whispered prayers that had no names, words born of fear more than faith. But the sound came closer, slow, dragging, sure. Through the cracks of the floorboards they saw the shadow pass, wide, dark, and unbroken. No human shadow was ever that whole. Then came the second shape, smaller but heavier, its movements thick with the weight of earth. Then a third, then a fourth, each one dragging something unseen, their feet leaving no prints, their bodies whispering against the fog. By midnight, 6 shadows walked the fields, each tracing a path toward the barn, each moving in time with the steady rattle of invisible chains. When morning came, the fields were empty again, but the barn doors stood open. Inside, 6 new hollows had been dug into the earth, shallow, uneven, as if done by trembling hands. At the center of each hollow was something pale, gleaming faintly through the dirt, a finger, an ear. A rib curved like a crescent moon, pieces, fragments, parts of her that refused to stay buried. The mistress fainted when she saw. The preacher vomited blood. The workers fled, some swearing they saw faces, 6 of them, whispering from the barn rafters, each mouth shaped around the same sound, Sev Nth. On the 3rd night, the wind carried voices. They came from the fields, soft as lullabies. The words were not English, not any tongue the living still spoke, but they hummed with rhythm, a chant, a call, a beckoning. The sound rose and fell like breath, like footsteps through mud. Children woke screaming, saying they heard knocking beneath their floors. One man said he saw a hand, long and grey, slick with clay, reach up from the well, clutching at the air before slipping back down. By dawn, the water in the well had turned red. The preacher left that morning. He walked barefoot, muttering, clutching a small pouch of salt. He did not look back. They found him 2 days later at the crossroads, eyes open, body stiff, mouth filled with earth. On his chest, pressed into the skin, were 6 faint bruises shaped like fingertips. That night, thunder cracked the horizon open. The 6 graves burst, the earth did not heave, and it opened. From each grave rose something neither whole nor broken, flesh pieced together by memory, bones that had forgotten their order, chains hanging loose like ornaments of penance. They walked, not toward the house, not toward the barn, but toward the forest, their heads tilted toward the sky as if listening, and the sound that filled the air was not the clink of chains this time. It was the sound of many feet marching, slow, synchronized, reverent. The ground trembled as they passed. At the edge of the forest, the air changed. The fog parted for them, curling like breath around a flame. They gathered before the old cypress tree, the one struck by lightning years ago, hollowed and black. The bark bore marks still visible in daylight, 7 notches, one never filled. The 6 unburied shapes stood before it, silent, swaying. Then, as if guided by one thought, they reached toward the ground and began to dig, not with shovels, with hands. With bones, the sound was unbearable, like teeth gnashing against stone. Dirt flew, roots tore, and from within the hollow of the tree something began to glow faintly. A shimmer of iron, a glint of flesh, a whisper of breath. It was the 7th part, the heart. The forest held its breath as they lifted it. The heart beat once, hard enough to shake the leaves. Once more, and enough to split the air. Then a 3rd time, and the chains that hung from their arms went taut, pulling, winding, twisting together like serpents in prayer. "She rises whole," a voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Whole," the others echoed. The moon vanished behind a wall of cloud. When the lightning came, the clearing was empty. The graves lay open. The air stank of iron. Only the tree remained, split down its trunk, glowing faintly red from within, as if something vast and newly awakened breathed inside. And far across the fields, back where the barn once stood, the ground began to tremble. Chains whispered from beneath the soil, and the dogs began to howl, not in fear, but in reverence. The blood that would not sink began to stir again, rippling like a tide drawn by a moon that had returned. The 7th part was found. Now she could stand, and the night that followed would remember her footsteps. It began again with the wind, that breathless wind that moved nothing, yet carried the sound of everything. No leaves stirred, no doors creaked, and yet, through the dusk-thick air of the plantation, a song moved, faint, lilting, broken by pauses that felt too much like gasps. It came from nowhere at first, then everywhere. Children heard it first. They hummed it while sweeping the porches, while chasing each other through red clay dust. A tune without words, born of something older than speech. Soft, circular, unending, the kind of melody that feels like it has always existed. Their mothers hushed them, frightened by what they could not name. "Where did you learn that?" One woman whispered. "Don't know," her boy said, eyes glassy, smile wrong. It just came. That night the gallows tree began to sway. Long before the song, before her name was whispered like sin, that tree had been the overseer's pride. A black cypress, tall enough to scrape the moon, its roots thick as serpents, its bark pale from years of storms. They said it grew from a grave. They said the earth there was rich with something not meant to feed roots. 6 bodies had swung from it in the past. Men, women, one barely grown. Their shadows had melted into the bark, staining it deeper each time. The 7th rope still hung unused, though not untouched. It creaked softly when no wind blew, as if remembering weight. When the song came, the rope began to hum in answer. The first night it was heard, no one slept. The air was restless, filled with whispers that sounded like laughter run backward. The fields glowed faintly red beneath the moon. Not blood, not fire, but something deeper. Like the ground itself was remembering light. In the quarters, the old ones muttered the same phrase again and again. "She's looking for the tree." The preacher's wife crossed herself until her knuckles bled. The overseer's son dreamed of a woman's shadow bending above his bed, her fingers tracing his throat in silence, and through it all, that song, low, slow, winding. "Hush, child. Don't you cry. The clay don't sink, the blood don't dry. Chains are sleeping soft and deep, but the gallows sings when angels weep." By the second night the melody had spread beyond the quarters. The white house up the hill woke to it. The mistress heard it drifting through the shutters, her candle shaking in her hand. She sent for the men. They came with torches, guns, and holy words. They circled the tree. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The rope hung still, swaying just enough to mock them. "Cut it down," one man said. "You cut it," another spat. "You hear it too?" And they did. The rope was singing, not loud, never loud. It whispered like a woman just behind your ear. The song was the same one the children hummed, only slower now, each note dragging like something caught between worlds. The overseer himself lifted his knife and sliced the rope. It fell heavy and coiled onto the ground, but the song did not stop. It grew louder. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Roots shifted. Bark cracked. And from deep within the cypress something groaned, a long, low sound that carried the weight of chains underwater. "Run," someone breathed. They did. When dawn came, the tree stood untouched, but 7 ropes now hung from its branches. That morning, no birds sang. The air stank of wet metal and smoke. Children no longer hummed the song, but the melody still wound through the fields like fog. It came from the soil, from the wells, from the cracks in the floorboards. The sound of breath, the sound of waiting. A woman named Althea, the oldest of the field hands, went to the gallows tree alone. She had known the chained woman once, had touched her arm, whispered prayers over her bruises. She had felt the strength of that sorrow. She stood beneath the branches and spoke softly. "You have all your parts now. All but your piece." The rope nearest her swayed. The knot turned slow and deliberate, facing her like an eye. "You know me," Althea whispered. "But don't call me yet." The ropes trembled. The wind shuddered once, then died. When the others found her in the morning, Althea was kneeling at the base of the tree, eyes open, lips blue. Around her neck a faint line, not of rope but of ash. By the third night the song was no longer a melody. It was rhythm, the pounding of feet. The sound of chains dragged through roots. Those who listened closely could hear the count. 6 steps, a pause, then one heavier than the rest. A rhythm of return. The overseer's wife began to lose her hearing that night. She screamed of whispers in her left ear, a voice saying swing again and again until blood trickled from her nose. They tried to flee the next morning. Wagons packed, horses bridled, but when they reached the edge of the property, the road was gone. The trees had moved. The forest had folded in upon itself, closing them inside the red clay like a hand around a throat, and from within that circle of land, the song rose anew. This time it came with voices, 6 low and 1 high. Not words, not prayer, just breath, vibrating against the air like a dirge. The gallows tree began to lean. On the 7th night, thunder rolled without rain. The ground around the tree split open, roots snapping like ribs. The ropes swung wildly, though the air stood still. And from the crack at its base rose a sound too deep to be human, a hum that carried bones inside it. The 7 ropes tightened at once, pulling upward, as though straining to lift something heavy from beneath the roots. And then, silence. The moon burned red. Slowly, the ropes began to rise. One by one they went taut, and the outline of a body took shape in the air, tall, impossible, made of shadow and iron gleam. Her feet did not touch the ground. Her head brushed the lowest branch. "You hang me once," she whispered through the trees. "I hang the world forever." The ropes burst into flame. The gallows tree screamed, not burned but sang, the same song the children once hummed, now made vast and terrible. "Hush, child, don't you cry, the clay don't sink, the blood don't dry." Chains are waking cold and deep, and the gallows sways where angels sleep. The fire did not spread, it burned only upward, turning light into darkness, wood into ash. When the flames died, the tree still stood, blackened, hollow, and humming faintly. At dawn, the mist lay thick across the field. The gallows tree was gone. In its place stood a woman of ash and chain, her eyes like two coins pressed to the surface of the earth. She turned toward the house, the barn, the graves. The seventh step sounded, and somewhere, deep below the clay, the soil began to laugh. The forge had been cold for 30 years, yet the air around it still stank of iron and ghosts. The blacksmith, Elias Crow, lived alone on the edge of the dead fields, too close to the ruins of the barn, too near the tree that was no longer there. His back was bent, his hair gone to dust, and his hands trembled as though still striking metal that refused to stay down. He had not touched a hammer since that night, the night they brought him the chains, 6 lengths of them, black and slick with something thicker than blood. They told him to melt them down, to make them gone, to forget their weight and sound. He'd done as told, though the metal had screamed in the fire, bending only after hours of defiance. And yet, when the last link sank into the molten glow, something in the air had changed, the sound of wind, the shape of silence. It had felt like closing a coffin on something that still breathed. Now, decades later, he sat by the forge that never quite cooled. And sometimes, when the bell in town tolled midnight, he heard them again, the faint, careful clink of metal tapping gently against his door. That night, the sound came sooner. The first toll had not yet finished when the knock began, slow, measured 3 times. Not with wood, not with flesh, with iron. Elias froze. His breath caught somewhere deep in his chest. The lantern beside him flickered, though no wind stirred the room. He turned, joints crackling like dry timber. Outside, the world was rainless but wet, the kind of damp that crept from the ground, not from the sky. The moon hung low and wide, red as cooling metal. Shadows shifted along the porch, heavy enough to creak the boards. He stood reaching for the poker. His hand found air. The second knock came, louder this time. The sound of weight pressing against wood, polite but patient, the way a debt collector might tap before entering. Elias's voice cracked when he spoke. "Go away." No answer. He shuffled toward the door, his knees screaming with every step. The latch quivered beneath his touch, hot as though struck by lightning. "You're gone," he whispered. "I saw you melt. I made you melt." A voice from the other side whispered back. Not a woman's, not a man's, but the echo of something heavy being dragged through memory. "We do not melt. We remember." He stumbled back, falling into the forge's glow. The coals stirred, though he had not fed them in days. Sparks rose like fireflies escaping a grave. He could smell the old metal again, that copper tang of blood married to heat. When he looked down, he saw 6 faint shapes pressed into the dirt floor. Oval, heavy, the impressions of manacles resting just beneath the surface. "No," Elias muttered. "No more ghosts." But the ground trembled. The prints deepened, filling slowly with something dark and glinting. Molten metal began to seep upward, bubbling, forming loops and links that curled like living things. They clinked softly, the sound unmistakable, the rhythm unbroken. 6 chains rising from the floor, steaming in the cool air. Elias staggered backward. His hammer hung on the wall, untouched for years. It fell without his hand. The longest chain lifted itself, its links sliding over one another like vertebrae. It coiled across the floor and stopped inches from his boots. Its end bore the faint outline of a shackle, open, waiting. "You made us," it whispered. He shook his head, teeth chattering. "I unmade you." The chain laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound, like nails poured into an empty coffin. "You tried." But she remembers. Outside the bell tolled again, once, twice, then 7 times, though the clock was built for 6. The air thickened. Shadows stretched long across the window, forming the shape of a woman tall enough to touch the roof with her gaze. The chains stirred. Elias turned toward the forge, desperate, frantic. He plunged his tongs into the coals, trying to rekindle flame, but the heat that answered was wrong. It burned blue, then black, then clear, the color of nothingness. The room filled with the smell of rain and rust. From the fire came a single voice, calm, low, full of ache. "You forged what could not be broken. You bound what could not be killed. Can't now, old man, the metal calls its maker." He turned, slowly, so slowly, and saw her standing there, not her whole. Not her form as it once was, but her outline drawn in ash and chainlight, the faint shimmer of heat above an open grave. Her arms hung long, wrists circled by the chains he'd once shaped. Each movement she made brought a sound, and not clashing, not clattering, but remembering. "You made me heavy," she said. "Now I make you hollow." The chains rose as one, their ends curling like tongues tasting air. Elias fell to his knees, trembling. "I didn't know," he rasped. "You knew," she whispered. "You just didn't listen." The first chain wrapped around his wrist. The second found his throat. They were warm, not cold like steel, but fever-hot. Pulsing faintly like flesh, he tried to scream, but the sound came out as metal bending, the room filled with the tolling of unseen bells. When dawn came, the forge was empty. The tools hung where they'd always hung. The coals lay cold, but outside the villagers found 6 new chains stretched across the path, laid out like veins leading from the door into the fields. They were rustless, freshly forged, still warm, and on the door where Elias's knuckles had once struck, someone had burned a mark, a handprint too large for any man. The palm seared deep into the wood. Those who dared to touch it said it pulsed faintly, like something breathing beneath. By the second night, travelers claimed they could hear hammering from the empty forge, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a craftsman at work. Sparks were seen through the cracks in the walls, though no one was inside. And when the bell tolled again, not from town, but from somewhere underground, the chains stirred, coiling toward the fields as if guided by memory. The key. Wind carried their clinking for miles. They said the sound echoed like the laughter of iron. They said the ground answered. And far beyond the blacksmith's house, where the gallows tree once stood, the earth began to tremble. Something vast and patient shifted beneath it. A woman-shaped shadow stretching, waking, listening to the chains that remembered her name. The 7th toll rang then, long, hollow, endless. Every forge, every tool, every bit of metal across the plantation shuddered in answer. And from that faraway field of red clay came a whisper so low it seemed to rise through the bones of the world. The chains are awake. The last link curled inward. The door blew open, and the hammer struck once by no human hand. They say the fields whisper when the moon is high, a sound like wind through teeth. The cane stretches for miles, pale green by day, black as old bruises by night. When the stalks sway, they scrape against one another with the soft hiss of sharpening blades. No one walks there after dark anymore, not since the harvest that never ended, not since the eyes began to gleam above the rows, too high, too steady, too knowing. The first to see them was a child. Little Ruthie Lyle had wandered from her porch at dusk, chasing a lantern moth that pulsed gold like a heartbeat. Her mother found her shoes the next morning, neatly placed at the edge of the field, toes pointing inward. Her footprints vanished 6 paces in. The men went looking, of course. 6 of them, carrying lanterns, machetes, and the smell of prayer. They did not find the girl, but they found marks. tall parallel scores on the cane, as though something had brushed against it from above. And that night, when the wind stilled, they swore they heard laughter threading through the leaves, laughter like the rustle of skirts dragging through dry grass. The next dawn, every cane stalk bent toward the Lyle house, their tips heavy with dew that smelled faintly of iron. By the time the harvest came, no one would go near the western acres. The cane there had grown too thick, the ground too soft. The overseer sent new hands, men who didn't know the stories. And by the third day none returned before midnight. They came back with blank eyes and cut fingers, muttering hymns out of order. When asked what they'd seen, they spoke only one word: watching. They said the stalks moved even when there was no wind, parting and closing as if breathing. That something vast and slow stood among them, its shadow stretching across the moon. That sometimes the rows whispered their names. No one believed them at first, until the dogs stopped barking, until the sugarcane began to bleed. It started small. A few stalks split open under the sickle, weeping a thick red sap that clung to the hands like syrup. The cutters said it burned when it dried. The overseer ordered them to keep going, muttering about rot and disease. But the next day the juice had turned black, and the smell, sweet, fetid, clinging, drew flies even at night. By the third harvest moon the field itself seemed to hum. A low, constant vibration beneath the soil, as if the earth were murmuring through clenched teeth. The canes swayed though the air was dead still, and when one man, bold or foolish, thrust his blade into the heart of the western plot, the ground answered with a sound like a sigh. "Who disturbs my rest?" The voice came not from above but from all around, from within the cane, from beneath it, from the breath between each leaf. The men ran, stumbling over their tools, and when they looked back they saw her, a shape taller than any woman should be, gliding slow and soundless through the field, her eyes twin lanterns of wet glass. After that the harvest rotted. The cane refused to cut clean. Blades dulled the moment they touched it. The soil grew black, slick, and full of veins. The workers left. The overseer hung himself in the storehouse, a sickle still in hand. But still the field stood. It grew thicker, heavier, darker with every year. And when the wind blew from the east, the stalks whispered in chorus a sibilant prayer in a language the living could not name. Only old Mother Janvier dared speak of it aloud. She said the woman in the cane was not a ghost, but what came after one. The remnant of something cut apart and rejoined, 6 times buried, 7 times bound. She said her name once, and her tongue swelled for a week. "She don't sleep," the old woman rasped to any fool who'd listen. "She waits. Every stalk got a piece of her hair. Every root remembers the weight of her blood. You swing a blade there, you cut her skin again. And she feels it. One year a drought came, the worst in memory. The fields cracked, the well soured, and the air itself turned to ash. The new owner, a man from the coast who laughed at superstition, ordered the field burned. It took 12 men and 3 barrels of oil. The fire caught quick, racing through the rows with the fury of pent breath. For a moment they cheered. Until the wind turned, the smoke did not rise. It fell. It poured downward into the earth, into the gaps between the stalks, coiling like a serpent returning home. The flames guttered, choking on their own blackness. The men stumbled back, eyes watering, and saw her. Through the veil of smoke, tall and pale, her face the color of old ash, her eyes 2 perfect spheres of wet light. The heat bent around her but did not touch. She moved with the weight of memory, her body half shadow, half harvest. Each step she took bent the canes toward her, as though in prayer. "You burn my hair," she whispered. "You starve my children." The men dropped their torches. The oil at their feet flared again, not with fire, but with light that screamed. When it faded, the men were gone. Only their boots remained, filled with black sugar. Now when the moon rises full, the townsfolk bar their doors and shutter their lamps. The cane glimmers faintly in the dark, slick and silver, as though weeping dew that smells too sweet to be water. And if you listen close enough, You can hear the rhythm of her steps between the rows, slow, deliberate, endless. Sometimes a low humming drifts from the fields, the same lullaby that once belonged to the woman who died there. The children hum it without knowing why. It makes the cattle uneasy. The birds refuse to fly over, and if you stare too long into the moving sea of stalks, you'll see them. The eyes, two perfect, unblinking orbs, catching the moon like mirrors. Too high, too still, watching, waiting. They say the sugar from that field tastes strange, too red in the light, too bitter in the cup. And if you leave it uncovered at night, by morning it's damp, glistening as if something breathed on it. Old Mother Janvier keeps a jar of it by her bedside. When asked why, she only smiles, toothless and trembling. She remembers kindness, she says, sometimes, but every year when the harvest moon returns, the field stirs again. The cane bends, the soil sighs, and somewhere deep within, something begins to hum, low, patient, gathering itself. Those who have walked too near swear they've seen her rise, half root, half flesh, taller than the field that bore her. The eyes open first, then the mouth, and before dawn the wind carries a sound that is not quite a scream and not quite a song, the sound of a woman calling her name back from the dark. At sunrise the field stands still again. The cane gleams with dew. The ground is slick, but if you look close, you'll see the shapes between the rows, the faint outlines of 6 men bent backward into the earth, their spines curved like scythes, their mouths filled with sugar. And above them, the eyes gleam as patient, unending, wet as glass. They never close, they never blink, they only watch. When the sun rose red and trembling, none dared to look east. For from that horizon came the sound of iron singing, and the whisper of 6 voices answering her name. There are mornings when the light feels wrong, not bright, not new, but remembered. That dawn was such a thing. The air lay heavy as fever, thick with dust and salt. The birds did not stir. Even the river that bordered the old plantation ran sluggish and dark, as if thickened with something older than water. Those who woke early, the widows, the drunkards, the ones too haunted to sleep, all said the same. The sun did not rise. It bled, it crawled from the horizon like a wound opening, the color of rust, the color of old chains. And beneath that bloody light the ground began to hum. It started low, a vibration felt in the teeth before the ears could catch it. Doors trembled in their frames. Nails shivered loose. The wind refused to move. At the edge of the fields the air rippled like heat. The sugarcane bent in unison, all facing east, as if bowing to something unseen. From the soil came a sound like the drag of wet metal, slow, rhythmic, inevitable. Old Mother Janvier was the first to name it. She stumbled from her shack barefoot, eyes wide with that same fear she'd carried for 70 years. "She walk in again," she whispered. "Lord save us." The 7th piece done found the rest, and indeed the earth seemed to breathe. The graves where they'd buried her, 6 unmarked mounds in the red clay, had burst open in the night. Each pit yawned black and bottomless. The soil churned like something had clawed its way out. Around them the cane had withered into ash. Only the chains remained, twisted into strange shapes, half buried in the mud. They pulsed faintly, like veins beneath skin. And then the voices began. They were low at first, a whispering chorus carried on no wind. 6 men, their words neither prayer nor curse, murmuring the same refrain in endless rhythm. "Forgive us, sister. Forgive us, sister." But forgiveness had long since rotted in that place. As the sun climbed, the horizon split. A tremor rippled through the ground, gentle at first, then sharp, cracking the red clay open like flesh. The hum rose to a metallic shriek. From within the fissure something glinted. Not fire, not water, but iron. Links, hundreds of them, chains ancient and black, unfurling from the earth as if dragged by unseen hands. They writhed across the ground, clinking and clattering like serpents made of sorrow. And from the heart of that pit rose the sound of a woman's breath, long, furious, unbroken. "You broke me in 6, she said, though no mouth yet spoke. "Now I rise in 7. The air grew colder. The smell of rust and sugar filled the lungs. The sun dimmed, though no cloud crossed it. In the nearby chapel the bell began to ring, though no hand pulled its rope. Each toll was slower than the last, trembling, uncertain. The preacher's grandson fell to his knees in the doorway, weeping. "She's coming, Grandmama," he cried. "The big woman. The one they chained. I can hear her walking." The old woman spat in the dust, her hands shaking as she traced a cross that meant nothing anymore. "That ain't walking," she whispered. "That's the earth remembering how to tremble." By midday, the first of the 6 appeared. They came one by one from the cane fields, their shapes wrong, their movements slow. Not ghosts, not flesh, something between. Their eyes were empty sockets filled with red dust. Chains hung from their wrists, clinking softly as though whispering secrets to themselves. They dragged their feet step by step toward the chapel, where the bell continued to toll without mercy. Each man stopped at the door and spoke in turn. "We buried her. We burned her. We failed her." The 6th looked up, and for a moment his voice was almost gentle. "Now she buries us." They turned as one to face the east, where the horizon shimmered with heat and blood, and from that shimmer came a figure, tall as the gallows tree, wrapped in the tatters of her own shadow. Her eyes burned with the light of a dawn that would not die. They say the sound of her first step cracked every window pane in the valley. The church's bell split clean in 2. She crossed the field without hurry, her movements heavy as centuries. Chains trailed behind her, dragging through the clay, etching symbols no living tongue could read. The people watched from their windows, too terrified to run, too enthralled to turn away. Children whimpered. Dogs howled. The air thickened until it was hard to breathe, and then she stopped, right before the chapel. The 6 men knelt, their chains clinking softly in rhythm with their trembling. "Sister," one whispered, voice quivering like a candle's flame, "we were told to do it." "We didn't know you'd—" The rest of his words never came. The chain at his throat tightened on its own, lifting him from the ground until his boots scraped the door. The others watched silent, as his shadow twisted and merged with hers. "You knew," she said, voice low and resonant, the sound of metal weeping. "You always knew." The 5 remaining men bowed lower, their hands pressed into the clay that still bled beneath them. "We chained you to the world," one sobbed. "But the world broke the chain." "No," she murmured. "I am the chain." The sun reached its peak, but it did not shine. It pulsed. Each heartbeat of light sent ripples through the ground. The cane swayed, though no wind dared pass, and as the townsfolk watched, the woman lifted her arms. The chains around her wrists rose like wings of iron. The ground split again, wider, deeper, until the red clay glowed like coals. From that pit rose a sound, and 6 voices in perfect unison, the same voices that had whispered her name for generations. But now they sang. Their song was not in any human tongue. It was the ringing of metal, the grinding of soil, the sigh of time itself bending beneath the weight of memory. The fields burned, but the fire gave no light. The chapel crumbled, but its cross remained, twisted into the shape of a noose. And when the smoke cleared, the figure stood alone, tall, unmoving, haloed in heat. At dusk, the horizon bled again. The red light stretched across the sky like a wound that refused to close, and somewhere beneath that endless, suffocating silence came the faintest echo of laughter, low, tired, and victorious. Those who heard it say the sound came not from the woman, but from the earth itself, as if the soil at last had remembered how to breathe. They say she walked east, her chains trailing behind like rivers, her shadow swallowing the sun. And when night fell, no stars rose, only the soft, steady rhythm of metal against clay, iron singing, 6 voices whispering her name forever and forever. until the dawn came bleeding once more.